Let's get started. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tarek Masoud. I'm a professor here at the Kennedy School of Government and the faculty director of the Middle East Initiative. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's talk, which is the first in a series of talks over the spring semester hosted by the Middle East Initiative on current affairs in the region. Now, today's guest is one of the most prolific observers of both the Middle East and the United States, and it's a really great pleasure to welcome him here today. Dr. Shadi Hamid is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center for Middle East Policy, and he's the former director of research at the Brookings Doha Center in Qatar. Dr. Hamid is a graduate of Georgetown University, after which he went to England as a Marshall Scholar, earning his doctorate in politics from Oxford University. His first book, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in the New Middle East, was published by Oxford University Press, and it chronicled the rise and fall of religious parties in the Arab world before and after the Arab Spring. And it is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand why political parties like Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood were able to seize and lose power in record time. Dr. Hamid is also the author of the remarkable 2017 book, Islamic Exceptionalism: How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, the themes of which he will actually expand on today. Now, in that book, Dr. Hamid delves headlong into the fraught, in fact, perilous question of whether there is something distinctive about Muslims that determines their politics. Now, anyone who's familiar with current trends in the academy, in which attributing political phenomena to culture or religion is often decried as essentialism or Orientalism, or held to be part of some other odious ism, must at the very least admire Professor Hamid's courage, or to use an Arabic word, chutzpah. And anyone who reads past the introduction of that book will find much more to admire besides just his courage. Because for anyone who's really seeking to understand why the modern Middle East is largely undemocratic, racked by conflict, with states that are unable to provide for their citizens, and with economies that fail to produce much of anything other than oil that the world wants to buy, the question of whether religion is implicated in these grim realities must be engaged, and Dr. Hamid deserves great credit for getting us to engage it. Now, in addition to writing big, bold books, Dr. Hamid also writes big, bold articles, mainly in The Atlantic, for which he is a contributing writer, and where he's really established himself as a fresh voice, not just on Middle Eastern politics, but on American affairs. And he brings a perspective on our polarized political moment that I dare say is heavily informed by his close study of the politics of that other highly polarized place, the Middle East. Now, you can get your dose of Dr. Hamid's wisdom and provocations by subscribing to his new podcast, The Wisdom of Crowds, in which he takes on the day's hot button issues with a mixture of insight, erudition, and good humor. And I will say we are thrilled to partake of some of those qualities this afternoon. Now, Dr. Hamid will speak for about 30 minutes on the theme of Islamic exceptionalism, after which I hope we'll have time for questions. I should note to everybody that this event is being recorded, so if you are not comfortable asking your question on camera, please message me in the chat, and I will try to ask the question on your behalf, time permitting. And with that, let me welcome and then cede the floor to our guest, Dr. Shadi Hamid.
Great. Thanks so much, Tarek, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. So let's get right to it. I might as well address the word exceptionalism, just so we're all on the same page. It's a word that admittedly can trigger people a little bit. It has different connotations to different folks. We see this in debates over American exceptionalism. It can be positive, but it can also be negative. But either way, it suggests not only distinctiveness, but also even strangeness. And increasingly, I would say, Americans, especially on the left side of the spectrum, we've become uncomfortable with the idea of deep difference, particularly if it's rooted in religion, theology, or ideology. So that's why, sometimes when I'll, use this phrase, Islamic exceptionalism, it will kind of elicit a particular kind of response. So let's dig into it. What do we exactly, how am I using it? Positive, negative, or something in between? I use the term more in a descriptive sense to describe a particular reality of how Islam is lived and practiced in the Middle East, but also in South and Southeast Asia. So the first question, I think, is easy enough, and it's also the title of this talk: is Islam exceptional? Question mark. My answer is yes, as you might have suspected. Also, the title of my book probably gives it away because it's called that. So all religions are exceptional in some ways. So, but here I'm talking about how Islam is exceptional in a particular way, in how it relates to law, politics, and governance, and how it has played and continues to play an outsized role in public life. And I would also say that in both theory and practice, Islam has proven resistant to secularization. Now, this can, of course, change in the future. There's nothing 100% deterministic about anything in life. In 100 years or 200 years, God knows what might happen, and there could be events that precipitate a different direction. But I would posit to you that in 100 or 200 years, all of us, or even less than that, will all be dead. So I'm not sure how relevant it is to speculate about what might happen centuries into the future. I would rather focus on what will happen for the rest of our lives, or most of our lives. Okay, so if Islam is exceptional, the second question would be, why is it thus? And I'm a little bit reticent to try to summarize 1400 years of Islamic history in a few minutes. So what I'll do instead is just maybe highlight a couple main factors, and if we want to discuss some of these details more, we can in the Q&A. First of all, I would say founding moments matter, even for a religion as old as Islam, 1400 years, and the same would go for Christianity, which I'll mention in a moment, which is around 2,000 years old. That founding moments can still matter many centuries into the future. So let's, as a point of contrast, take Christianity. There is no real developed account of public law in the New Testament. But why would there be? The early Christians were living as a minority under the rule of others. They were not in a position to govern. So why would the New Testament say much about governing? That would be the kind of logic here. And not only that, it's not just the New Testament doesn't say much about law. It's actually somewhat the opposite. It actually has a negative view of the law. New Testament is for the most part antinomian or anti-legalist. And one example is Paul in Galatians saying, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. So here we have Paul talking about the law as a curse. That is pretty negative. You won't find anything comparable, for example, in the Quran. Now, so the founding moment of Islam is also quite important in this regard, and specifically the founding figures here matter. So Paul was obviously one of the founding figures of Christianity, and I'll mention Jesus right now. I mean, Jesus was a dissident against a reigning state. Prophet Muhammad wasn't, or at least he wasn't later on in his career as a prophet. And in addition to a prophet Muhammad was also a head of a proto-state. And he was also a state builder. So this has major implications because regardless of whether or not you believe the Quran is from God, either way, it would have to have something to say about law and governance. Otherwise, it simply wouldn't be relevant to the people it was addressing. So if Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslims were contending with questions of governance in Medina, and God was revealing scripture to them, I mean, imagine their situation. They're trying to figure out how to govern this new mini state. They would presumably want to have some guidance from God on how to do that in the appropriate way. So as Tarek alluded to in the intro, I have been accused of essentialism, which is fine, I guess. But I would say there's there's nothing essentialist about historical contingency. And partly what I'm doing here is making an argument about how religions are products of their historical circumstances. So let's consider a counterfactual. If the early Muslims hadn't been in control of Medina, then presumably the Quran would have said different things. And not to kind of go into controversial territory, but we can also imagine that if, I mean, Muslims don't believe that there's any kind of revelation after Islam, but let's say hypothetically that God, that God wanted to reveal a new scripture, and he decided to do so in New York. Presumably, that scripture would say very different things because it was addressing a particular audience in a modern era that had very different sensibilities. So we always have to be thinking about who is being addressed in the revelation of scripture. Similarly, if Paul had somehow become a holder of political office, then presumably he would have had something different to say about the law and whether or not the law was a curse. So that lays out, I think, some of the basic ideas. Now, with all of that in mind, I want to jump to the modern era. Why does all of this matter? Because you might say to yourself, I mean, this is interesting from an academic or a theoretical standpoint, but why should we care 14 years later when we're dealing with modern problems and modern nation states and so on? So, and we are, I should note, I guess today is February 18th. So we're almost exactly at the 10-year anniversary of the fall of Hosni Mubarak, which is a moment in my life which was quite central. I was actually in Tahrir Square that day when Mubarak fell. I won't go into what it felt like to be there. I'll only say that that experience living in the Middle East at the time and seeing how it turned out, which was in short, not very well, has definitely made me, it's made me have a darker view of human nature. And you'll probably see some of that in the rest of the talk, but we'll see if I can end on a more positive note. Okay. But basically, we can't understand the failure of the Arab Spring, and I think failure is exactly the right word here. If we want to look specifically at Egypt, the rise and fall is a very stark one. The euphoria that I think a lot of us saw that day, February 11th, 2011, and then the coup and then the massacre that we saw just about 2.5 years later in 2013. So we have a somewhat clear story of rise and fall. Now, to understand the failure of Egypt and the failure of the Arab Spring more generally, I don't think we can do that without taking religion seriously. And not just taking religion seriously as a dependent variable, if you think about it from a political science standpoint, but also religion as an independent variable, as something that causes and is not merely caused by other factors. And in the social sciences, for many decades, there has sometimes been a tendency to diminish the role of religion because we're uncomfortable talking about intangible things. And it's easier to measure, let's say, unemployment, underemployment, rural urban migration, being angry at the US. These are all factors that have been used to understand the region, and they are all relevant. I'm not saying they aren't, but I think it's also important to ensure that we're taking religion seriously along with those other factors. So when I look back at the failure of the Arab Spring, first of all, the problem isn't Islam. The problem wasn't Islam. The problem wasn't even Islam's outsized role in public life. Rather, and I think this part is important, the problem was the inability to accommodate Islam's role in public life. So that's how I make a distinction here, because sometimes people might see snippets of the argument and they say, Shadi, are you saying Islam is a problem? No, it's actually quite different. I'm saying that the inability to resolve foundational questions around Islam is a problem, and one of the main problems in the Middle East, and it has been now for several decades. The question of Islam's relationship to the state and the state's relationship to Islam, I would say, has been a foundational divide since independence and even before independence. So we would really have to go to the early 20th century to kind of see how this problem is making itself manifest. And this is where understanding the evolution of Islam from around, let's say, the 19th century into the 20th century becomes important. But even if we go more in the pre-modern era, Islam, so let's say we were talking 5 or 6 centuries ago, Islam provided the overarching legal, moral, and religious architecture. It imbued everything. It went without saying, so it wasn't said. There was no need to sort of affirm your Islamic credentials, because basically no one questioned that this was the nature of the various caliphates or regimes that were in power. You had incredible diversity within these caliphates, where you had different philosophical and intellectual interpretations of Islam, but no one, even the most so-called liberal Islamic philosophers, questioned that Islam was at the center. And there's, one of the examples of this is, like Ibn Sina, one of the great Islamic philosophers, was known as enjoying copious amounts of wine in private with his friends and other philosophers. So he's someone who clearly was not respecting the Islamic prohibition on alcohol consumption. However, Ibn Sina always upheld the public prohibition on alcohol consumption. He never argued that the state should shift its view on morality, because Ibn Sina took it as a given that this was important for social stability, and this is where the legitimacy of caliphates derived. So that's the pre-modern era. Then as we kind of move into the 19th and 20th centuries, something happened. Well, first of all, we see the introduction of this new group of people called Islamists. And it's worth really emphasizing that the word Islamist did not exist in the 14th or 15th century, because it wouldn't have made any sense to use it, because if everyone agreed that Islam was the overarching structure, there was no need to affirm your Islamic identity or to say that you wanted to apply Islamic law, because Islamic law was already being applied. So it would have been redundant to use terms like Islamism and Islamist group or Islamist movement. But then something happened with the introduction of secular ideologies in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this creates a kind of a new diversity and a new set of divides over religion that have remained with us to this very day. So in response to these secular ideologies, what happened basically? You had first what was called the Islamic Modernist, and then the successors to that, the Islamists. And one of the first groups that was well known was the Muslim Brotherhood. They come in and they're responding to what they see as the threat of secular ideology. And what do they do in response to the threat of secular ideology? They basically make Islam into a distinctive political project. Islam no longer just was. It wasn't the way it wasn't something that was there that was natural. It became something that had to be advocated. And Sharia became something that had to be applied, because it was being deprioritized in these new secular legal systems. So, and it's really interesting if you look at how Islamists talk about applying. They always use the word apply, tatbiq sharia as the term, the application of Islamic law. They also use phrases like mashru' al-Islami, mashru' meaning project. So they see, and that means the Islamic project. So they're literally taking a religion and they are saying that this religion is no longer just a religion in the normal sense. And even that idea of what a religion is contested in the modern era, but that it's becoming not just a religion, but also a project. Now, in this sense, Islamists depended on their opposite. Without secularists and without the introduction of secular notions of being and privatizing religion, Islamists would not have come into being. And it's actually interesting that if you look at countries even today that never really had strong secular elites, they also don't really have Islamist parties, or certainly not strong Islamist parties. And Senegal is actually a really interesting example of this. Also, the Gambia. I don't mean to like bring up like random countries, but they are two Muslim majority countries that we don't pay attention to. So it's interesting to look at some of these less well-known cases, and we can see how this juxtaposition works out. Islamists need whatever their opposite is in order to have a raison d'etre. Okay, so so moving on, we also have a role that nationalist regimes play at the beginning of independence in the 1950s and 60s, where they're attempting to control and dominate their societies. They know intuitively that religion plays a very important role. So they felt a need to basically domesticate Islam, and they did that through a variety of mechanisms, including basically absorbing traditional religious institutions like Al-Azhar in Egypt. But this actually had the effect of further politicizing Islam. So basically what's happening here is that because of this fundamental divide and cleavage where people don't agree on the basic question of Islam's role in everyday life, and they don't agree on the role of Islam in the state, you have growing not just diversity of opinion on religion, but also polarization. And the polarization is anchored around not a traditional left-right divide as we had for much of the Cold War in various other parts of the world, but the kind of left-right spectrum in many Muslim majority societies becomes oriented around what your particular view of Islam happens to be. And the Last Caliphate, as many of you might know, was formally abolished in 1924. And I think in some ways it's fair to say that the problem of how to integrate Islam within the nation state has been the unresolved problem since. So when I'm trying to understand the Middle East, that's an important background context to keep in mind, that the Arab Spring is not just a new thing, although of course it is relatively new. It did happen 10 years ago, but it's also building on a set and drawing on a set of developments and divides and polarization that had been building for much of the 20th century. And this lack of resolution over the role of religion became clear, very clear, in a couple of countries, including the two that I focus on the most, I would say, Egypt and Tunisia. And we saw how that played out. Obviously, in Tunisia, it worked out a little bit more positively. Egypt, we've already mentioned, ended in a coup and a massacre. So what we have in those situations in those two countries, that we had Islamists on one side and secularists on the other. Of course, that's an oversimplification because we had various shades in between. It's a very diverse spectrum. Also, within the Islamist camp, you have different kinds of Islamists that are trying to, in a way, outbid each other on who is more faithful to the cause. So in some sense, this growing diversity and division over how people interpret Islam in politics, it's not necessarily something to lament, because it's just a reality. There's no way to really undo it. And I think one aspect of the modern condition is once you introduce, or once high levels of ideological or ethnic diversity are introduced in a society, it's very hard to undo them. So, I mean, we have our own examples here in the US. We will probably never, I would argue, become united in the way we think we should be, because diversity is the state of being, and this is who we are. And I think it's also very difficult to ask people to basically put aside their deepest convictions in the name of some artificial sense of unity. So the same applies in the Middle East. It's hard to ask an Islamist to stop being an Islamist. It's hard to ask a secularist to stop being a secularist. You can do more than ask them, and that's where the other option comes into play. And I'll talk about, so, I've laid out some of the problems in my last kind of section here. I'll want to lay out what I think some of the possible solutions are. I basically think there's three ways of dealing with this. There may be more, but these are the three major ones, I'd say. One is to somehow accommodate or even normalize Islam as well as Islamism in the political system. This requires political pluralism as well as democracy, although not necessarily liberal democracy. So, and this is where I've been a critic of the idea that for democracy to actually take hold in the Middle East, we have to be promoting a specifically liberal version of that. And we can get into, that's a longer conversation, but I would just problematize this idea that the only good kind of democracy is a liberal one. And you might guess why that might be something to problematize, because in countries where Islamist parties represent the largest opposition parties, or maybe the second largest in certain countries, at the very least, they're going to do well in elections. And sometimes they'll win, sometimes they won't. Sometimes they won't win, but will become part of coalition governments. I would argue that this has major implications. It means basically that if you want to see democracy emerge in the Middle East, you have no other option but to acknowledge that Islamists will play an important role, including possibly in positions of executive power. Okay, so that's option number one, which maybe if we wanted to have a broad heading, we'd call that accommodation. Basically, we're trying to accommodate Islam's outsized role in public life. If you take my argument as a given that Islam is exceptional in this way, what do we do about the exceptionalism? We figure out ways to accommodate it, because if it's not going away, or if it's difficult to make it go away, generally that leaves only one option, which is to come to terms with it and to find a way to live with that reality. The second option is to insist on secularism or secularization. Now, this doesn't mean full-on secularism, because let's say in Egypt, Sisi is not a secularist. In fact, very few people are real secularists in Egypt. At least publicly, everyone sort of pays homage to the idea that Islam is important. They just disagree on what exactly that means in practice. But at the very least, I think that there is an insistence, if we look at some of Sisi's supporters, that Islam should play less of a role in politics than it did under the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's better to maybe look at it as a spectrum of secularization or lack thereof. So this might sound like an okay approach, maybe not the Sisi version, but why not just say, we as Americans, if we're looking at it from our perspective here, wherever we might be, and obviously some of you are watching from different countries too, but it would seem logical to insist on secularism if we as Americans are secular, or we think that secularism is a better way of dealing with things, and there could be, so on and so forth. But the problem here is that the insistence on secularism, I would argue, inevitably leads to coercion. And I have not, there may be one or two exceptions, I have not seen how an insistence on secularism in the Middle East does not lead to coercion. Why? Because if the majority of citizens want Islam to play some significant role in public life, and I think the polling here is really hard to avoid or dismiss, and we can debate what people say when they say that they think Sharia should play a central role in public life, but they think that Sharia matters in some way. So if a majority of citizens want this or believe in this, then basically secularization requires forcing people who are not secular to privatize their religion. I don't know how you can do this without the use of force, or without some very aggressive ideological campaign that will ultimately have some coercive elements. So in short, secularization requires either ignoring mass sentiment or suppressing mass sentiment. Now, from a moral standpoint, I would object to that, mostly because I don't like repression. But I would also say that even if you are okay with repression from a moral standpoint, and there are people who are like that, I mean, many of them are my relatives in Egypt, but we don't have to go into that right now. But even if you don't buy the moral side of it, there's also a question of efficacy. Is it really possible to kill an idea that has broad support? And when I talk about the idea here, there is the Muslim Brotherhood version of the idea, which is specific. That's a specific school of thought. But more broadly, there are, let's say, ordinary Egyptians or Jordanians who may not agree with the Brotherhood or like the Brotherhood, but they still have some sympathy to the basic premises of Islamism. They wouldn't call themselves Islamists because that's like a very specific term. And, most people aren't ideological in that way where they're self-defining with those kinds of labels, but they would agree with many of the ideas that Islamists support, again, having to do with the centrality of Islam in public law, politics, and legislation. So, so that's a reality that we have to acknowledge, and it's hard to force people to stop believing in those things. The last option, and this is where I'll come to a close, is a more intellectual one, which doesn't really require as much talking about the practicalities. It's mostly just a hope that you could have, and you just sort of don't get involved, which is basically to essentially hope for a reformation. And I didn't want to get into this too much because I think the whole, like, does Islam need a reformation debate is kind of lame and tiresome and sometimes utterly absurd. But putting aside the actual content, I would again go back to what I said at the beginning, that we don't know what's going to happen in 100 and 200 years. It is theoretically possible that Islam could go through something like a reformation in our lifetimes. I would suggest to you that it's extremely unlikely. So if it's unlikely to ever come for the foreseeable future, what particular practical use is it as for us as academics or scholars, policymakers, to actually hold on to this idea? It's also an odd idea insofar as it doesn't recognize Islam's distinctiveness. It assumes that Islam could follow the same trajectory that Christianity did. But if Christianity is a different religion than Islam, as I think should be self-evident to one degree or another, why would we ever presume that a different religion with a different history, with a different founding moment, with a different founding figure would imitate Christianity's kind of trajectory of reformation, enlightenment, and then secularization? I think we really have to question where that premise is coming from. Also, the Reformation line is a bit patronizing, and I think for the Muslims on this Zoom call, I think many of you have probably experienced what I've experienced, where someone will be very well-meaning and will say, Shadi, hey, I feel bad for the Middle East, and also that's sort of like an odd thing to say to me. But feel bad for the Middle East, all that. Don't worry, we Christians went through a lot of that too. We had our own wars of religion, and you know what? We got through it too. So don't worry. I mean, you guys are a little bit slow, you Muslims, but maybe you're taking your time. You'll get there. I mean, that could be very well-meaning. And this also goes to my point about Americans in their effort to sometimes suppress the reality of difference, because difference forces us to talk about difficult topics. If we're not all the same, it means we have to talk about how we're not all the same. And that can lead to uncomfortable conversations. But my basic premise, and one that I think I've become more comfortable with over time, not just from living in the Middle East, but also living in the US, is that we aren't all the same. And I would also say that it's unclear why we would even want to all be the same. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shadi. I think if we were in person, you would get some serious applause right now, and appreciation before we dive into our discussion. So thank you for that. So Shadi, I'm going to try to not abuse my position as the moderator of this event too much, but I can't resist abusing it a little bit. And so first, what I wanted to do is just ask you a little bit about the causal mechanism by which Islam exercises its pull. So the story you've told, if I'm describing it correctly, is that Islam was founded under a particular set of circumstances. The Prophet Muhammad was a particular kind of person who did particular things, and all of that became part of the founding documents and doctrine of Islam, that then over 1400 years exert a pull on the behavior of Muslims. So, for example, the Prophet Muhammad, as you pointed out, was not just a spiritual leader, but a temporal leader. He actually offered an example of government, and that's a hard thing to transcend, because it will continually exercise a gravitational pull on the behavior of Muslims operating across history. Is that a fair description of the argument?
Yeah. So, of course, no one is bound to their founding moment, but I think it's also fair to say that no one can fully escape their founding moment. And again, would you really even want to escape your founding moment? I don't meet a lot of Muslims who are like, oh, that founding moment, we're kind of not down with that anymore. Let's like kind of forget about it. First of all, Islam wouldn't be able to sustain itself in terms of its intellectual architecture if you discarded Prophet Muhammad's experience in Medina, for example. So I think that that's certainly part of it. And I mean, not to go too much into anecdote, which is sometimes a little bit impressionistic, but I think one way of looking at this is that there are certainly more reformist or even secular reformist tendencies among Muslims. And there's a number of examples that I talk about in the book, but I also emphasize that there's a reason they never gained mass traction. Because to argue that Muslims should discard aspects of Islamic law, not just so it's fine to reinterpret Islamic law. In fact, there's more kind of mild, let's say progressive type Islamists like Ennahda in Tunisia that have been very much at the forefront of arguing that we can reinterpret Islamic law. So for example, they're not calling for the hudud punishments, cutting off the hands of thieves and that sort of thing. Even though traditionally Islamists have held on to that because it's kind of there. That said, what Islamists have done in more modern times is find ways to contextualize the relevant verses or hadith. So you can do that. And I think all Muslims do that to one degree or another. What Muslims don't really do as much, except for a small minority, is say Islamic law doesn't matter.
Right.
And that we shouldn't even pay attention to Sharia, that Sharia in the modern context is simply irrelevant. It's hard for me to imagine how, even in relatively secularized countries like Tunisia, how arguments like that would gain ground. And we know empirically that they have not gained traction because despite decades of basically forced secularization in Turkey and in Tunisia, still significant majority of people still think that Islam has a public role to play. So you also have to ask yourself, even if you do force secularization and doesn't produce the results that you want, that might tell us something. And I'll just mention one other factor in addition to the founding moment, which is also related to the founding moment in a way, which is how Muslims interpret the Quran. And here's an important contrast with Christianity. And I remember that growing up and going to Sunday school, to clarify, Muslim Sunday school, we have that too, at least here in the US. I think there was always a fundamental misunderstanding of Christianity that we as Muslims were sort of like, it was kind of put on us. And I didn't really realize how wrong it was until later, where Muslims would say the equivalent of the Quran is the New Testament. That is not actually true. The equivalent of the Quran in Christianity is Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh. Jesus Christ is the central anchor for what Christianity is, similar to how the Quran is the anchor for Islam. And this becomes important because it affects how Muslims view their scripture compared to how Christians view their scripture. With maybe very few exceptions of a couple of fringe groups, even right-wing evangelicals in the US today, they would say that the Bible is the word of God, but they would not say that the Bible is God's speech. And this is a very important distinction. I go into some detail in the book because Muslims would say that the Quran is not only the word of God, it's God's actual speech. Mm-hmm. In other words, Muslims from a creedal standpoint believe that every letter and word in the Quran is directly from God. There are no human intermediaries. Prophet Muhammad played no role in the text itself, where Christians have to admit that human beings played a role in the New Testament, because literally it says Paul said, Paul is saying things. It's not God relaying what Paul said, so on and so forth. So this also makes it difficult to discard aspects of Islamic law, because if the Quran has, as a scripture, is more central to the Islamic self-imagining, let's say, or how Muslims imagine themselves, then again, it's hard to go to a Muslim and say, hey, the Quran, despite being God's actual speech, not just, you can, not only should you reinterpret the verses of Sharia, you should go one step further and ignore them. Again, a hard argument to make that is unlikely to win many converts, so to speak.
Great. Thanks for that, Shadi. So I guess the question then is, what is it sounds like you're saying the mechanism by which this reproduces itself over time is simply that because these rules and these laws and these commandments are in the text and they are God's word, it becomes very hard for a Muslim to transcend them. And so I guess the question is then, can you offer me an explanation for what is going on among those Muslims who do manage to transcend them? And so we know, for example, that as you pointed out, right, you said that one of the reasons the Arab Spring failed was because there was a quote unquote difficulty accommodating Islam's role in public life. So who are these people who had difficulty accommodating Islam's role in public life? And why did they transcend whatever gravitational pull the founding moment has, while others were not able to do that?
Okay, so one thing I'll say before I get to that is I think the fact, a lot of what I'm describing might sound negative to a Western ear. So if you come from a secular background, what I just said about the Quran, you might be like, oh, wow, I'm not down with that. It's worth noting that for many Muslims, this is precisely the point of Islam. It's compelling for precisely this reason. I mean, if you hear Muslim apologetics, if it oftentimes focuses on the fact that the Quran is not like other scripture, and precisely that it is God's actual speech. So in some sense, this is literally the point. And drawing on Michael Cook's arguments in his book, Ancient Politics, Modern Religions, or maybe it's the reverse, I forget. But Michael Cook, the Princeton historian, he makes a really interesting argument that that basically it's a question of what resources a religion has. So if you're looking for a way for Islam to be relevant in public life, you can go back and find things that resonate, and not just resonate in the pre-modern era. Much of what Islam has to offer has also modern resonance. So there's, if you look at aspects of Sharia or the prophetic hadith, there are egalitarian concepts that have been very resonant when people are justifying democracy. So when you look at how Islamists got on board with democracy, they were making reference to ideas that are inherent in the Islamic tradition, where if you compare to, say, other religions, you might not find those same kind of resources. Now, Tarek, for your question, why the people in Egypt, let's say, who who were on the other side of this and weren't willing to accommodate Islam's public role, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were secularist. There's a mixture of factors, and here I would want to avoid a sort of monocausal story. Islam is part of it. And just to give you guys an example, one thing that I heard quite a bit, around the time of the coup, from my Egyptian friends and relatives, the vast majority of whom were very anti-brotherhood. I mean, some of them were quite devout and practicing, but then they would say, but for them, it had to do with their fears of what the brotherhood might do in the future and how the brotherhood would alter Egyptian identity and the identity of the state. There was this idea that Egypt has been a certain way since the 1952 revolution slash coup, depending on how you want to interpret 52. Um, and they saw the Brotherhood as coming in and challenging something which they had themselves come to see as a status quo that was benefiting them. And here some class and economic elements are tied in as well, that if you're part of an economic elite and the Brotherhood is a counter elite, then that's another factor that gets overlaid on the ideological divide. So I don't want to say that it's only about different conceptions of religion, but certainly a discourse that you heard a lot was the Brotherhood is foreign. They're not truly Egyptian. They're importing new ideas in. They're going to sell the pyramids. They're going to sell. I mean, the stuff was like bonkers. What people would actually say in the conspiracy theories, and also that the Brotherhood, is an insular organization. There is, I think, a legitimate concern that if a group or a party tied to the Brotherhood comes to power, usually when a party comes to power, anyone can like theoretically join if they just like get on board and they want to like take part in the patronage and be on the winning side. An issue with the Brotherhood is if they win, if you're someone who doesn't like the Brotherhood, it's hard to join that ruling structure because there's a clear ideological divide. And also to join the Muslim Brotherhood as a member, although it's changing in some countries where they're making it a little bit easier, but there's a process of basically vouching where if people know, for example, that you engage in mixed gender activities, or if you drink or party in Zamalek or whatever, and word gets around, they're probably going to block your application to be, well, it's not really an application per se, but your effort to become a member of the Brotherhood will sort of be blocked. So there are these other factors, but they do all relate to a fundamental question about the appropriate role of religion. So this is not to say, again, that it's about whether or not you're secular or not. It's about differing opinions along a spectrum, and then other things get added to those debates, like class and economics and elite intra-elite struggles. And then I think the last thing here is that it there's also, I think, a disdain of the masses, and this is where I think there's some interesting parallels with the U.S. But sometimes when you give people the right to vote, and not just sometimes, increasingly it seems to be the case throughout the world. If you look at the Brazil, India, Philippines, you name it, Israel, when people have the right to vote, they tend to vote for bad. They seem to have a tendency sometimes to vote for bad parties, and parties that are racist, illiberal, nationalist, whatever it might be. So I think there's a bigger question here about whether we are even comfortable with the idea of democracy. And if I had to sort of define the core of democracy in a sentence, I would say, in many ways, it's the right to make the wrong choice. People have a constitutional right to do and say and believe dumb things as long as they're not breaking the law. So obviously you can't go around killing people because most constitutions don't allow that. So there's still going to be a constitutional and legal framework that limits what people can do. But within that, democracy means mass sentiment sometimes takes precedent. You have a bunch of elites in Egypt who have basically been, in some ways, like plundering the country for decades, and you're telling them to respect ordinary Egyptians. And oftentimes they look down on ordinary Egyptians. And I remember I was talking to my aunt who right after the first parliamentary elections during the Arab Spring, where the Brotherhood did well, but also Salafis did well. And here we are in this very like elaborate apartment close to the presidential palace. And she was just flabbergasted because she's like, okay, I knew about the Brotherhood, but 27% of my fellow Egyptians voted for Salafis. She's like, I don't know my country. And I think that's also part of the story here, is it feels very disorienting when you don't recognize your own country.
Yeah. So Shadi, I mean, one question is how powerful is this gravitational pull really? So you just described the process by which so-called Islamists, who, if there's anybody who exhibits an excessive fealty to the text, it should be the Islamists. But you described a process by which they accommodate themselves to a form of government that is nowhere to be found in the holy text and is completely alien to the experience of the Prophet Muhammad. And you justified that, or you tried to indicate how that's consistent with your theory by saying, well, they justified it with reference to principles that are located in the texts. But of course, you can justify all kinds of modern political arrangements with principles that are located in the Islamic text. And so, if these most hardcore of loyalists to the word of God could see their way clear to accommodate this Western invention of democracy, where you have people actually voting for leaders, then how powerful is this gravitational pull that you're talking about? What will the example of the prophet really prevent Muslims from accommodating and adopting in the modern world?
Great question. So my argument about Islamic exceptionalism doesn't apply to the specific form, the specific outcome. What it applies to is the general desire for Islam and Islamic law to be central. Now, different groups can take that basic premise and apply it in different ways, and that's where the diversity comes in. So I would never want people to take my argument, and I do try to really emphasize this in the book, because I don't want people to misuse my arguments, like some far right person who's like, oh my God, here's the brown Muslim Shadi saying that Islam is weird and weirdness is bad. So so in that sense, you know, so let's take even large majorities in Indonesia and Malaysia say that Islamic law should play a central role in public life. Sometimes the numbers are a little bit lower in certain countries, certainly like Tunisia, that is more secularized, but still we're talking about majorities. But if you ask a Tunisian and an Indonesian, what does it mean to you to have Sharia playing this role? They would probably give you completely different answers. That's context dependent. And also, the Islamic tradition itself is a rich, diverse tradition. So sometimes when people hear me saying, oh, Islam plays an outsized role in politics, they think I'm saying that Islam plays a certain kind of outsized role in politics. No, that can take a variety of different forms. And that's where the flexibility comes in. And that's where I think Islam is very adaptable for the modern era, precisely because that flexibility is built in. Because as you alluded to, Tarek, democracy is not in the Quran or in the Sunnah, but there are ideas of shura which you can sort of repurpose. There's if you're creative about it. And there's also Islamic legal concepts that Islamists use a lot, maslaha arguments, basically what means public interest arguments. So they can say that an IMF loan is haram in theory, but if it's in the public interest and there's really no way to avoid it because you're dealing with realities of international politics, they'll basically do a workaround and they can then accept an IMF loan. And so that's something in that, with that in mind, I think I would never want people to think that Islamists are pre-modern. Islamists do not hearken back to the 7th century Arabia. Islamists, as I kind of touched on very briefly, are successors of a movement that came before at the end of the 19th and early 20th century called the Islamic Modernists, Muhammad Abdu Afghani, and then the next generation was Rashid Rida, and then he was the link to Hassan al-Banna, and there's a kind of intellectual lineage. There's a reason they were called modernists. First of all, they came to terms with the state, because everyone in the modern era has to come to terms with the nation state. There is no other option. And if anything, one could say that Islamists have become too enthralled to the state. And, so I think in some ways, if another way that I define Islamism, or I sum it up conceptually, I say that Islamism is the attempt to reconcile pre-modern Islamic law with the modern nation state. But that's obviously very difficult to do. How do you square the circle on that? These are two things in opposition. And that's part of the struggle that a lot of these groups are going through. Islam was not designed for the modern nation state. I mean, it quite literally wasn't. It was revealed to people who were operating in a different context where states weren't really states in the modern sense.
That's great. So I do want to open it up for questions, and I still have a number of questions of my own, mainly because it's just so gratifying engaging with you. But I guess the last thing I would ask you is, you pointed to the existence of Christian groups in the Western world that may seem Islamist like. That there are these groups like the Christian dominionist groups who believe that law does need to be brought into accord with biblical values. And so I guess my question to you is, what is it about those people that is enabling them or causing them to treat their religion in a way that you said the religion can't be treated because of the example of Jesus and because of the status of the New Testament and how that's different from the Quran? What's going on with those people?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, they're a very small fringe, and they don't really have much of a hold on mainstream Christianity, even mainstream.
Mike Pence
No.
is one of the look. When Mike Pence, as governor of Indiana, passes a law saying that you have to bury fetal tissue or cremate it in order to accord it the dignity that, how is that not a Christian politician trying to remake the laws in order to more closely conform to what he thinks the Bible wants?
Yeah, so I think that's more about taking Christian values and finding ways to. I mean, so for example, like you would never hear Mike Pence or really anyone use the term application of Christian law. There is really no such thing as Christian law per se. I mean, the closest
Biblical
thing is
law? You'd hear people talk about biblical law.
Yeah, more like Old Testament biblical law, like Handmaid's Tale, that kind of stuff. But you don't really hear people calling it. I mean, first of all, the Old Testament law is like pretty hard to implement because some of the stuff is like pretty inappropriate. Like even by Islamic legal standards, like that's a different level. So you don't. I mean, it's not. I'm not saying that you don't have aspects of that in American public life, but it's not framed in a comparable way of, again, people, there are small groups like the Michelle Bachmans and people like that who are more dominionist influenced. They will talk about biblical law more explicitly. But Mike Pence is focused on a couple big issues, abortion being one of them. But are there other ways to kind of bring Christian law into public politics? There's not a big program there. There's not a lot you can work with. In Michael Cook's terms, there aren't as many resources upon which to draw. If you're focusing on the New Testament, Mike Pence can't really go to the New Testament and find a lot to justify an argument for the implementation. Also, you never hear people say the implementation of Christian law. Again, that really wouldn't make sense. I mean, the closest equivalent is canon law in the Catholic sense, but even that is more about the immediate surroundings of the church and more about the church's domain and its internal hierarchy. It's not really about public law per se. Again, not to say that there aren't maybe some parallels with specific individuals or more kind of extreme leaning groups, but the fact that you're not going to have a Christian party that has Christian law on the top of its platform winning an election, I think tells us something. But America is also still one of the more religious Western countries. The fact that in other formerly Christian majority countries in Europe, I mean, there's really no one who's making these kinds of arguments. I mean, it's really worlds apart.
Yeah. I mean, one could say that if you looked at the evolution of Christian democratic parties in Europe that came about in the end of the 19th century in a manner very similar to the history you offered of how Islamists came about, that might suggest that some kind of evolution or change was possible. I mean, the big thing is that I find much of what you're saying is to be really not just provocative but true. I agree with you. But I'm wondering if, the more modest form of the argument you've made at the end of this talk, which is that, look, there's a lot of things in Islam. I'm not saying that Islam Islamic texts prejudice the outcome. I'm just saying that when people talk politics, they frame and justify and argue things in Islamic terms. Then what are we really explaining? Are we just explaining a very small phenomenon, which is that when we argue about politics, we'll hearken to the Quran, but of course, the full panoply of arrangements is open to us? Or because it sounded like at the beginning of the talk, you were saying, no, not all arrangements are going to be open to you because you are truly limited in some respects by what God said. And towards the end, I feel like you're saying, no, we're actually not limited. There's flexibility. It's just when Muslims talk about politics, there's a lot of God talk there, in which case it's an argument about form and not necessarily an argument about substance.
So on that, I would say that if Islamists win elections, there are things that they will try to do which goes beyond mere rhetoric. I mean, we can talk about, I mean, it's a long conversation about what that might entail. And Islamists themselves don't exactly know what they want to do when they come to power, because coming to power is a very fraught situation for them. And we don't have a whole lot of examples. I mean, Turkey is sort of an interesting example, but is a little bit of a different context than most of the Arab countries I've focused on today. So in that sense, we still have a lot to learn about what Islamists would do if they have a longer time in power. But some of the basic things that I think would actually have major impacts on like let's say, again, the self-imagining of citizens, which is Islamizing the educational curriculum, Islamizing state TV in various ways, giving financial incentives for kind of natalist initiatives. In other words, having, encouraging people to have more kids. There could be restrictions on alcohol consumption, restrictions on gender mixing, on certain levels of schooling. There could be an effort to make Al-Azhar and other religious institutions have some advisory role when it comes to reviewing legislation, not binding, but just advisory. So there's a number of things that could have real implications. Again, like, would it be the end of the world? Are we talking about like Iran or Afghanistan? No, but that goes to show that, yes, Islamists do evolve. Islamists aren't all evil people who want to put everyone in a burqa. Of course, I presume your audience doesn't really buy any of that anymore. That's kind of outdated. But I think that I would never want to take my argument to sort of the far extreme of presuming that a lot of this stuff is set in stone, because it just and I don't feel like I really need to make that argument to actually convey the basic notion, because we're still struggling with the basic idea of accepting Islam, and by us, not just people in the region who oppose the Muslim Brotherhood, but when it comes to our own administrations, what's one of the main reasons the US has been so reticent to support democracy in the Middle East? It's because we believe in democracy in theory, but we're afraid of democracy's outcomes in practice. Why? Because there's a particular kind of group that tends to do well in elections in the Middle East, and they're called Islamists, and we're just not comfortable with that.
Yes. So this is great. This is great, Shadi. I mean, the last thing I do think that, for this argument to hang together, one thing I don't think you said explicitly, and I just want to make sure I understood it correctly, is you do believe that Islamists represent the most authentic expression of Islamic politics, right? Like if Islamists are just one of many potential ways of putting Islam to political work, then again we could imagine a very broad menagerie of political parties, including some that are liberal, that could claim Islamic justification. It seems part of the assumption here is that the Islamists are the most authentic expression of Islamic political values, right?
I wouldn't say that they're the most authentic expression, but I would say they are perceived to be the most authentic expression by a plurality of voters in many of these countries. Now, again, we're not so. Again, I want to emphasize there are very devout people who want Islam to play a role, who would say the Brotherhood is like, we don't like them at all. So there is that diversity, but generally, that's one reason that Islamists tend to do better than other parties is because they're more effective at claiming, again, putting aside whether it's true objectively, they're able to present themselves in this authentic way. I would not say myself that Islamists are authentically Islamic, because in many ways they're a modern innovation, as I laid out. They would not exist if it wasn't for modernity. They are a product of modernity. And in that sense, one of the critiques of them from Salafis and kind of ultra conservatives on their right flank is that they're too innovative, they're too creative, they're too flexible. And it's not really my job as an American who really isn't part of the internal debates in these countries to tell Egyptians or Tunisians what is authentically Islamic. I think it's the ballot box in some sense, where that's the only place that can be adjudicated. Again, that doesn't tell us what's true. I mean, presumably when we all die, I don't know if God will provide some kind of guidance on this and say, here's what the most authentic expression of Islam was. Now that I kind of kept you guys, in mystery for, thousands of years, here's who was right in each particular century. Maybe that's how we'd find out. But until then, and this is why I believe democracy is the best available form of government for Muslim majority countries, precisely because we have no way to adjudicate these foundational questions. There's no way for one side to win over the other. So we have to defer to popular sentiment.
Okay, let's open it up for questions. Thank you for that, Shadi. So we'll start with Ghadir Konna.
Oh God, this has been very interesting. Thank you, Professor Shadi. Oh my God, there are things, obviously I agree with you. There are things I beg to disagree with you, and it's all good. So I had questions for you that I actually sent saying that this is what I intend to ask. Lakin, when you were speaking, I'm like, oh, hell no, I have a whole set of new questions for you.
You get to ask one, just so, because I get to the other people. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So I'm a Sudanese, so of course we went through our own revolution. And from my experience as a Sudanese and my family, I can tell you that we've had, as you know, 30 years dictatorship with the Muslim Brotherhood and the military. And actually it was the Muslim Brotherhood, that doctrine that actually ended up shaping the military. And so, which is why they stayed the 30 years against our will. My question is this, because where we stood, which is a little bit different experience from Egypt, where Egypt pretty much got rid of them. So we've had the experience in Sudan to see how un-Islamic they are. And so religion, but again, going back to decades, my question would be this: religion has always been used as a source of power in all faith, and even pre-Brahimic faith, or non-Brahimic faith. Then we cannot, because we know that, and that is the knowledge, then we can't really blame the religion. We can only then at this point blame the people who choose to pick and choose the parts of the religion and control the masses, and including the rulers.
Right.
Would you say that proper education, which is, we have a lot of Muslims who say they're Muslims, they as you said, will support Islam, but they actually don't know much about Islam. Should education then be the source of where we can educate people?
Great. Shadi, so there are two questions really there. The second question is about the education, but the first question was, don't all politicians use religion to justify their actions? And so I'd like to take another question. So, and then you could, we'll take them in pairs. Thank you, Ghadir, for those great questions. So I'll come now to Abdurrahim bin Alberto. Go ahead.
Thank you, Shadi, very much. I really like the dialectic you set up and sort of asserted that that you can't end on either extreme for the reasons you let out about Islamic exceptionalism and the issues with the Brotherhood. So my question is, for these other countries, Senegal, Gambia, Indonesia, Malaysia, why have they avoided this polarization, and are they doomed to fall into it, or are they never going to fall into it?
Great. Okay, go ahead. Thank you for that.
Okay. So there is this perpetual debate of if Muslims do bad things, to what extent, in the name of Islam, to what extent is Islam implicated? I think I fall somewhere in between, in the sense that I don't think Islam can be completely irrelevant to the question, because if Muslims are drawing on their own perceptions of Islam, they might be wrong, they might be misinterpreting something, but ultimately Islam is a product of what God willed, but it's also a product of how people understand it. And this is always the challenge, because we have no access to God's will in this regard. So, I mean, right when the Quran essentially descends into the temporal world, it can only be accessed through human interaction. Like, quite literally, when you open the Quran, it is being mediated by your own mind as a human being. So you will not have any certainty about what God intended. You might try your best, and that's what Islam, asks Muslims to do. But that's really important, that there is always going to be this perpetual tension, and that leads to a lot of confusion, especially for a decentralized religion. It wasn't always decentralized, but certainly in the modern era, it is a very decentralized, I would even argue democratized religion, in the sense that everyone kind of finds their own sheikh and comes up with their own like made up fatwas, and people talk about it in the coffee shop, whatever. So, but in some sense, I also don't like the rhetoric of using, I know obviously some people are using religion cynically, but it's hard to know what's in people's hearts, and people are complicated. So they might be partly cynical, but they might also believe part of what they're saying. And we can take the most controversial example. I never liked the argument that ISIS is merely using Islam for power. In my reading, some of them did, but some of them actually seemed to believe what they said. It doesn't mean that that's the right. Obviously, I think most of us believe it's an extremely distorted interpretation of Islam, but that doesn't mean they think it's a distorted version of Islam, right? In terms of education, I would say I'm skeptical of this argument that education can actually improve practice, because we don't agree on what a good Islamic education looks like. The most Islamically literate people I've hung out with in the Middle East actually tend to be Salafis. And whenever I see a Salafi and a Brotherhood person debating, the Brotherhood person gets crushed, because Salafis can quote chapter and verse and hadith, and they know about a lot of the scholars from back in the day, even if they don't agree with certain scholars, and they are just very theologically literate. I think their whole methodology is problematic, which is why I'm not a big fan of Salafi ideas, but that's a methodological objection to Salafism. It's not that they're uneducated per se, right? I also, some of the most educated Islamic scholars, like Ali Goma, for example, Bin Baya, people like that, they supported one of the worst massacres in modern Middle Eastern history, and they used Islamic justifications for it, i.e. the Rabaa massacre, where 1,000 people were killed in broad daylight in one day. How can someone who is so learned, like the great Ali Goma, how can he actually provide Islamic justifications for mass killing? I'm skeptical about the education part. And then Malaysia and Indonesia, I actually talk about them in the first chapter of my book towards the end, if you're interested. What Malaysia, Indonesia, and to some extent Pakistan have done, they've normalized Islamism. So Islamist parties have been legal. There's many of them, especially in Indonesia and Malaysia. So they kind of compete with each other. But because there isn't the same kind of secular elite, Islamists don't gain as much traction from being Islamist. But also what's interesting is that you have secular parties like Golkar in Indonesia that have actually implemented Sharia ordinances on the local level, because Indonesia is a democracy. So even secular parties, if they want to meet the median voter and get support in conservative regions, they actually talk up a big game on Sharia and actually do what we would normally expect Islamists to do, not secularists. So in that way, there's a kind of outbidding where everyone is sort of playing for like the Islamic conservative voter. And in that sense, you reach a conservative consensus where the threat of Islamic parties is no longer an obstacle to democracy. And that's where I think those models become very promising.
Great, Shadi, thank you for that. So we'll take two more questions. So I have Samat Kubba and I have Zach Warely.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much again for just taking the time to talk with us today. It's been very, very educational and just really exciting. I wanted to ask you kind of a curveball question, if you even consider it that. But I was thinking about your, like, kind of your ideas about, like, Islam's exceptionalism, and I wanted to ask you, like, what your thoughts were regarding the emergence of new trends such as, like, Islamic feminism and progressive Islam in the context of political and social change in the Middle East that's being influenced from outside of the region. So essentially, like, can the relationship between the religion and public life kind of almost be reversed, where a changing world can create new understandings within Islam?
Great question. Thank you, Samat. And Zach.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us. I got to say, I love your Twitter, so keep tweeting. My question is sort of if there was a universal sort of Western recognition of your argument about the potential and durability of Islamic democracy, that we said, yes, this is the way to do it. This is the way for democracy to prosper in the Middle East. What would that mean for US foreign policy and the way we go about it? I mean, taking Egypt as an example, would it mean that we finally stop pretending to support democracy? Would we actually withhold all or some of that security assistance? I guess I'm wondering if you think there would be an active role for the US or the international community to play in creating an enabling environment for Islamic democracy to thrive in Egypt or elsewhere, or if it's just something that, you know, the West needs to get out of the way and let that sort of unfold on its own.
Great question.
Okay, on the first one, I think that we do see a kind of flourishing of progressive Islam, if you want to use that phrase, here in the US. And that's actually where I sort of lean in terms of my own Islamic commitments. But I think that that is very particular to the unique environment that we have to be in. We don't really see that emerging as much in other Western democracies. In fact, you might argue that we're seeing a turn to conservatism in some of the hotspots of, you know, France and Germany with the children of immigrants from the Middle East and elsewhere. And there's also an interesting argument to be made, which, you know, wasn't really the focus of this, and it opens up a can of worms about how do you apply Islamic exceptionalism to what's going on in Europe now? Is that the right frame to understand certain developments? So I think, look, it's certainly, I think that, but what's interesting about the American interpretations of Islam is that they haven't really spread to other parts of the world. I mean, that's an aspiration you sometimes hear from American scholars and American Muslims more generally, is that they can be a beacon to Muslims elsewhere. But here again, I return to context. It's very hard to be on board with American Islam if you're not American. It's like a distinctly our thing. And we're kind of finding our way and exploring and all of that. So I think it's promising. I think it's really interesting. I just don't know how much legs it has elsewhere. And then for the second question, I don't think the U.S. should ever endeavor to support Islamic I don't think we should be taking sides on what the form of democracy actually ends up being, or how Islamic or un-Islamic it should be. I don't think that's really what US policymakers should get into. What I think they should do, however, is be committed to processes and to say, basically, you know what? We're going to support democratic processes and try to be as neutral as we can. And then whatever the populations in question decide to do, we will respect those outcomes, even if they vote in bad people or bad groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think it's totally fine to think the Muslim Brotherhood is bad and dangerous and ideologically problematic. I mean, that's kind of how a lot of Americans view the Republican Party. But I would never call for, I mean, maybe some people are calling for this now, but I would never call for banning the Republican Party, because that would deprive tens of millions of Americans from their preferred mechanism to express their political opinions. And what does democracy have to be? It has to be responsive and reflective to different factions and in public life. So that's where I think that, you know, the US, it's going to be a huge challenge for the US to come to terms with this. And we weren't able to come to terms with it during the Arab Spring. I mean, why was Obama indulging the coup? And why did Kerry say about Sisi after the coup that Sisi was restoring democracy? Even though Obama himself was intellectually open to Islamist participation, there was a part of him and a part of other Obama senior officials. They always saw Islamists as more problematic than the non-Islamist alternatives. Let's imagine that the coup happened against like a liberal Western darling type, like Muhammad al-Baradei, for example. Would Kerry have been as enthusiastic about Sisi restoring democracy? Probably not. So this is where I think there is a lot of room for a lot the US can do better. And one thing is we have a lot of leverage. We could basically ground the Egyptian army and the Egyptian Air Force rather quickly if we say, Egyptian military, we are suspending not just additional military assistance, but also spare parts and maintenance. And that's important because they wouldn't be able to keep their equipment running if we withheld that kind of logistical support and assistance. It's very vital to the operation of the Egyptian military. I dream of a day when we can actually live up to our ideals abroad, and really just say something very basic is that we're not going to prejudge outcomes any longer. We're not going to be trying to hope for some liberal party that's pro-American to win, because that's unlikely. It's certainly the pro-American part's going to be unlikely regardless, because even liberal parties can be quite anti-American in places like Egypt for specific policy reasons, right? So that, I think, is something we have to be paying attention to with the Biden administration, future Democratic administrations. How do we take some of these ideas of accommodating Islam's role in public life and applying that in more discrete policy terms?
So thank you for that, Shadi. We have, we've kind of got you a little bit over time, and I'm wondering if you have just a bit more time to answer one other question that you raised and was raised in the chat with me, and that really is the question about how does the Islamic exceptionalism argument inform how we should understand things like France's attempts right now to push laws against, quote, Islamic separatism, right? If the idea is that, look, Muslims are actually distinctive and they are, constantly under the traction of 7th century ideas, then does that legitimate some of what the French state and what other liberal countries want to do with respect to their Muslim minorities?
So Tarek, you wanted to open the can of worms about France and Europe. Okay. Okay. Let me try to do the short version here. As someone who has been involved in the France debate, and some of my French friends don't like what I've been saying, as you might guess, but let me try to explain how I approach this. Okay. So France is, like all other countries, is context dependent. So out of the 7 or 8% of Muslims in France, it would be a mistake to say that all of them, or even the vast majority of them, are conservative or religious. We know this isn't true. We know it's sort of like a half and half situation. There is a portion of the French Muslim population that is very secularized and supports laïcité, so on and so forth. But there is about 50% of the French Muslim population that says, according to recent polls, that Islam is very important in their daily life. Now, how do we interpret this 50% number? One way of interpreting it is saying that that's very low for Muslims, because if you look at Indonesia, the comparable number is like 95%. So clearly secularization can have some effect in a country like France. So we get down basically from like 90% to maybe something closer to 50%. Wow. But here's the problem. The rest of the French population, the non-Muslim part of it, is at 10% on that same measure. Only 10% of French people say that religion is very important in their daily life. If we go to Sweden and Norway, the number can go as low as 6 or 7%. So basically what we have is a kind of exceptionalism problem, that no matter how much secularization we've had so far, and there has been quite a lot, the gap in religious observance between French Muslims and French non-Muslims is about 40%. It is a massive gap. And despite French Muslims only being 7%, you will see much more visible examples of Islamic practice when you're in Paris than you will of Christian practice. And just think about that for a moment. France is a country that was formerly the vast majority were Christian or of Christian heritage. Now we have a situation where Islam is more visible than Christianity. Okay, so we have two ways of dealing with this. That goes back to my similar rubric. One way is to basically say the French government should force French Muslims to get on board with the secular ideals of the Republic. I think this is problematic because it goes against basic commitments to freedom of religion, especially think about the headscarf. The headscarf is a personal choice. I know the French don't always see it that way, but you're basically interfering with how individuals decide how they want to practice their religion. If you're someone who says, I want to register the swimming pool for 1 hour in the local swimming pool, for it to be women only, which is something that happens in the US with Orthodox Jewish groups and Muslim groups, and it's not a big deal. But if you want to do that in France, that's a huge controversy, and sometimes it's simply not allowed, so on and so forth. You should have a right to be conservative in your own religious practice as long as you're not forcing anyone to agree with you. But that is a very contested idea, and I don't think the French government should, again, try to force Muslims to change their own practice, because that gets at something that is so fundamental to the individual, which is their own relationship to their God. That to me is anathema. That to me is a deal breaker.
But Shadi, it isn't a deal breaker for you, because when you talked about Muslim countries, you're perfectly willing to accept Islamist political parties that would impose precisely the same kinds of restrictions, that strike at precisely the same kinds of deeply held commitments that individuals have regarding their relationship to God or not having a God at all, that you're not willing to allow the French to engage in. So you're saying in the Middle East, we can have a liberal democracy. We can have a democracy that doesn't actually accord people freedom to do whatever they want. But in France, woe betide you if you do that. Isn't there an asymmetry here?
Okay. So one difference is that I probably should have emphasized this, I consider French policies that are aggressively secularist to be completely democratically legitimate. The majority of French citizens support how their government is approaching this, because the vast majority of French people are pretty secular, and they see these founding ideals as intertwined with the French Republic, and they don't want to lose that, understandably. So I think that where I come out is that Muslims who live in France have to respect the law of the land, even if the existing laws are illiberal and problematic for all these reasons. I am also kind of, I suppose, holding France and just Western democracies to their own standard of being more accepting. This is what they say they are or should be, of minority sentiment. So I think it's fair to ask the French if that is in fact, well, the French don't always say that they're great at dealing with minorities, but I think for a lot of Western democracies, it's about how we understand our own standards. Obviously, in the American case, that's an important part of the self-conception that minorities can be who they are, so on and so forth. But at the same time, I think there are limits to what Islamists should do if they come to power in Muslim majority countries. And I do talk about how this is where constitution drafting becomes important. And so in that sense, there has to be some way to circumscribe how far Islamists can go. And I would apply my arguments to really any party or government that comes to power through democratic elections. They should have a wide berth because they're democratically legitimate, but we have to figure out where the red line is, right? And I think each society, through its own constitution drafting process, decides where that line is. But generally speaking, I wouldn't want to see a situation where you're seeing a kind of direct interference in people's personal religious practice, like let's say in their own homes, or it's also like, what would an Islamist party do that would prevent someone from practicing Islam in their own way in the public sphere? We should probably talk about what some of those scenarios are, and then the Constitution would delineate what would be acceptable or unacceptable to do. And then again, constitutions are very important in that regard. But it is interesting you mentioned that, Tarek, because that is actually one argument that my French interlocutors sometimes make, which is like, Shadi, you seem like a little bit harder on French people than you are in certain situations in the Middle East. So, and maybe there is a tension there. And I also probably can't claim to be 100% consistent on every single issue. There's a tension in my own work. And I just try, probably the best way of addressing that is to just be open to the fact that there may be some tension.
Yeah. No, and I think, the way I would probably put it is I would say, you're taking their claims to be liberal seriously. If you want to be serious about calling yourself a liberal, then this is what you have to accept. And I respect that. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've had the rare treat, I think, of being in contact and communion with a really special mind, somebody who thinks very deeply about issues of just global importance and is willing to talk about them in a kind of open, exploratory way. It's really a special treat. So, Shadi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Tarek. Really enjoyed this. My pleasure.
This was great. And everybody, please join us again at this hour next week when we'll be joined by Dr. Nadim Shahedi of the Lebanese American University, who will speak about the crisis in Lebanon. Until then, thank you again, Shadi, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Bye.
Thanks, Tarek. Bye.
Bye-bye.